I'd like to welcome everyone who just joined us. Here in America, we're still holding by the saddest day of the calendar. It's Tisha B'Av. In Israel, it's already over. And I actually think it's very symbolic that we have one of our guests here in the States, in New York, with me, my very good friend. And another guest is also a good friend. He's in Israel. And we're going to have a dialogue / conversation on, I think, an important topic on Tisha B'Av. We would like to have a little bit of a contemporary perspective on what is Tisha B'Av today. Of course, it's the day of a national tragedy, of a national, we could call it National Memorial Day. But how are we to deal with the current contemporary situation where we already have a state of Israel? We have Jerusalem in our hands. Also, this year, events, pandemic, everything that happens with us today, how does it affect us? How does it affect Am Yisrael, the Jewish people? How does it affect our way of commemorating the events of the past and how we look into the future? But before I continue, of course, would like to introduce our guests. First of all, we're having with us Rabbi Tamir Zaltzman, my good friend for many years. Rabbi Zaltzman, he is also a former rock musician. Not many people know that, but I happen to know. I listen to his rock music. It's quite amazing. It's actually quite amazing. And he's also, not many people know, a former IDF officer. Of course, Rabbi Zaltzman lived in Israel for many years, and he learned in yeshiva there. And he also was, I believe, an officer, right? Am I right?
What?
You were an IDF officer, am I right?
Correct, yes.
That's correct.
I was an IDF officer in NASA. This is like a cool name for one of the units in the Israeli army, NASA.
Amazing, amazing. So I'm very happy to have you here with us. And from Israel, we're having our also good friends who, of course, went through RAGE programs, and I know him for many years. Here, his name appears as Tzvi Lifshitz. We also know him as Greg Lauren. So if you don't mind, Greg, I got to call you just Greg. Is that okay?
It's all good.
We know you're a blogger. We know you made Aliyah, so I should say Mazel Tov on that. And we also know that you're distributing wines from Judea and Samaria here in America, which is an amazing thing.
Yeah. Yes.
Tell me, Greg, how was this Tisha B'Av this year? How was it? With Corona and everything.
It was interesting. It was hot as always, at least in Israel. I'll just say, like, kind of bluntly, I always had an issue I guess I always marveled at people who were able to cry on Tisha B'Av, because I always ask the question, like, how do we cry for something that we never saw, from like 2,000 years ago, destruction of something from antiquity. And then I watched, this afternoon, somebody sent me a link to an Israeli documentary about the Gush Katif expulsion, or they call it the disengagement, they like to call it. And I was watching, like, these 18, 19, 20-year-old, speaking of army, kids who were sent to pull out their, counterparts who were like 16, 15, 17 from like yeshivas and their homes. And this documentary showed like the interaction between these kids, like in depth, and how these army kids were like praying and crying, and they were trying to comfort these kids. And all these kids are doing, the Gush Katif kids are yelling at them like, how could you? And these kids are like, well, And
it's important to tell our listeners and those who listen to us right now, this happened on Tisha B'Av. Am I right, Greg?
It happened, it happened. It actually started the day after, which is actually still connected to Tisha B'Av, because as we know, the temples burn until the next. That's why we don't, there's a whole halacha. We don't drink wine and eat meat until Hatzorah the next day. So I was watching this, and I started crying. I was like, how this is impossible. This is impossible. How a Jewish government supposedly could send these young kids to pull out these young kids, and it's like you're pitting, innocent soul versus innocent soul. It's not like some like story of like Yudin Rouse pulling out these kids, And I, for the first
You
time
know,
ever on
Greg,
Tisha B'Av,
you brought fresh memories because I actually remember very well when this happened. It was on TV, almost live, everything that happened. And I was in Israel back then, and I was learning for my rabbinics, studying for my rabbinics I was in the old city, and I remember some of those kids, some of those families were protesting in the old city. They were putting those tents, and people were crying. People were crying. Some of the soldiers who had to do that were also crying. It was a terrible thing.
no, I was just saying that, like, it's almost like Hashem sent us something that, you know, in I guess halacha we call it bata b'shishim, like 1/60th of what it felt like 2,000 years ago. So we like have that feeling. You know what I mean? Not that it's good, not that it's a good thing, but it's almost like it was sent on this day. It was sent on Tisha B'Av, or, you know, the 10th of Av, this time period. You know, I can only imagine what it's like, what Tisha B'Av was like in Gush Katif itself, in these,
Right.
you know, the schools, to sitting Eicha, and the next day you're going to be pulled out of your house. I mean, it's nuts. I can't even imagine. But yeah, so that was kind of like the brunt of my Tisha B'Av experience this year, which was pretty powerful. Yeah.
Before we get to the modern contemporary stuff, and I think we're going to talk about what happens today. I think that's very, very important. It's good that you brought up in the context of your commemorating Tisha B'Av this year in Israel, but you also brought up some very fresh memories of what happened in our recent history. But I think we just do a little sketch of the events that happened in Tisha B'Av. I'm sure most of those who are here with us know, but we're still going to do a little bit of an introduction to, you know, we call it the National Day of, we can call it National Day of Tragedy, National Day of Mourning in our history. So, you know, the very first thing, of course, comes into mind is something that connects us with Israel. As a matter of fact, our sages are telling us that Tisha B'Av happened as a tragedy and started as a day of tragedy as a result of Jewish people weeping for no reason. They were afraid, they were scared by the spies who said, we cannot conquer the land. There's no way for us to get into the land. And as a result, Tisha B'Av evolved as a day of tragedy. So we have all those events in our history, including Jerusalem, including the expulsion from Spain, including all different expulsions in the medieval times to different European countries, including the beginning of World War I, and so on and so forth. This list goes, right? And the Gush Katif is the latest we saw. And throughout history, it really played as a day of a national tragedy. Now, I would like us to ask a question to Rabbi Zaltzman. Rabbi, what do you think? I just got to call you Tamir. That's how we call each other, we're friends. Right? So,
Right, correct.
So what do you think? This whole perspective on a national mourning day today, and you're a teacher, you're an educator. Most of the people.
Oops, what happened?
Why not?
He disappeared. Okay, let us pick up from there. So it looks like Rabbi Haskin asked me about how do we teach it, maybe? What was his intention to ask? I'm not sure, but Tisha B'Av always catches me like off guard for two reasons. One reason, I'm trying to to emulate some big rabbis of the past that were like, I was very influenced by the stories that like one rabbi was buying a fresh book of kinos, of these morning songs that we recite on Tisha B'Av, and was after the Tisha B'Av was putting it straight in the Geniza. Like the Geniza is the how to say the it's honorable way of disposing of the holy writs. So we cannot throw anything that has Hashem's name in it just into the garbage can. Rather, we should bury it with some kind of reverence. So that was a very inspiring story for me, that about the rabbi who was like really believing that this Tisha B'Av is the last Tisha B'Av, and he would put the kinos in the Geniza at the end of the Tisha B'Av, like showing his straight belief that we don't have to do it anymore. And it's very hard to prepare to Tisha B'Av, you know. It's like I also do funerals sometimes, And there's a very big difference between the families, between their reaction to the death of the beloved one. If it happens suddenly, if it happens like in relatively like normal age, I mean, if it happens without any preparation, and if it happens after like a long sickness, long disease, when people are like already said goodbye many times to the beloved one, and when it actually happens, they like very content with that. They don't grieve as much. So also to prepare to Tisha B'Av, it is like that. Like we are going to say goodbye to our beloved. We are going to say goodbye to our beloved, and when it comes, then it doesn't move us. As a result, so I personally prefer like not to get too much prepared to Tisha B'Av. Obviously, we need to teach about it, but we have during the year many different occasions to teach about Tisha B'Av. And then we learn the main stories on Tisha B'Av itself. So this is a very good way, like to, when we don't overemphasize the preparation to Tisha B'Av before Tisha B'Av, then when it comes, and then when we tell stories about the destruction and about the tragedies, and we contemplate about all what happened to us, not only with the destroyed temples, but also with expulsions and all the pogroms that happened during the Holocaust, obviously. I really try to stick to this approach. During the year, we have enough events that remind us about the temples and destruction of the temples. So the best thing is really to gain some to think about how to cry actually on Tisha B'Av. Maybe to store the most emotionally tensed events in our life and to recall them on Tisha B'Av. For that purpose also, there is a Jewish tradition to go to the cemetery on Tisha B'Av. Actually, Rav Moshe Feinstein said that you don't have to go actually to enter the cemetery, and it shouldn't be even the Jewish cemetery, could be any cemetery. But just the fact that you come into the contact, into the touch with the world of death again, and you contemplate our own mortality. This is the best way to, to connect to the Shabbat. Also, if you remember that in the wilderness, actually, the Jews traveled in the desert for 40 years. Shabbat was the day of death, when they would dig the grave and would lay down in the grave and wait whether they will get over this Tisha B'Av or not. So also through the connection to death, to the anticipation of death, we can better understand the Tisha B'Av.
Thank you for that. I must tell you, first of all, I must confess that you notice what happened here. I literally, as I was talking about connection was the last word that you could hear, because I lost connection. Yeah. And as my computer was plugged in, apparently, it was plugged in actually, connection disappeared. I think it's very, very symbolic. And it lost the battery, right? It lost the power. The Jewish people kind of feel weak. You spoke a lot about death. I tell you the truth, I feel a bit of a discomfort here when you talk about death in general, but also in the context of what happens today. Because you know what, I just want to bring this up as, I guess, as a vision that I have, that I feel. I would like to ask both of you, Greg and Tamir, what do you feel about it? How you react to this? This is probably my first time at the Western Wall, at the Kotel on Tisha B'Av. I must have been in yeshiva then. It was back in the 90s. You know, I made Aliyah in 91, and I was studying in yeshiva. It must have been 93, maybe. I'm not sure exactly, maybe 92. And one thing I remember, going there to the Kotel, going to the Western Wall, two crowds, very distinct crowds. One crowd of people, and they were all dressed in black. That's of course Haredim, wailing by the wall with traditional kinot, with traditional ekah, with all the traditional readings, and weeping and crying, which is a traditional way of how we commemorate Tisha B'Av, more or less. And then another group, which I literally saw meters away from them, also by the wall, wearing white, by the way. Not black, but white, which is also part of a symbolism, I think. And that's a national religious crowd from Yeshivat HaKotel, with some soldiers singing and dancing on Tisha B'Av. And this absolute, almost like schizophrenic type of, you know, like dichotomy, right? Where you see like the opposites, like literally white and black, weeping and crying versus singing and dancing on the same day. It was like, it stuck in my mind, and I was thinking a lot about it. And until today, I tell you the truth, I don't know who's right. So my question to both of you is, what do you think about this image? And what do you think, who is right here? Let's start with Greg.
I don't think it's a question of right or wrong. I think it's a question of there's segments in Israeli society. There are certain segments that draw their, how they deal with certain things from the past and from certain elements of the Galut. And there are certain segments of Israeli society, and I'm talking about just within the religious sphere, that are looking, you know, they're looking in, let's say, into the Tanakh and what the prophets are talking about, and they're seeing, okay, there's developments that are happening, and we're now going to be looking at the future. Meaning, you know, I had a friend ask me yesterday, you know, she said, good Yom Tov. I'm like, what do you mean good Yom Tov? She's like, oh, am I just looking at the future? Because apparently, you know, they say that Tisha B'Av will be like a happy day once, you know, it's going to be turned from a sad day into a happy day. So it's almost as if there are already people in Israeli society, in religious society, you know, what have you, the Rav Kook crowd, not me, but the people are looking already ahead. They see what's going on. They see the progression. They see, you know, these are people who, like, they'll say Hallel on Yom Ha'atzmaut. They'll say Hallel with a bracha on Yom Yerushalayim. Very distinct difference from what you'll see from the Haredi crowd in Israel. Again, it's not a question of right or wrong. It's a question of just your lens and how you see things and where you think we are. And you can make the case.
You say it's a question of perspective. One group is focused on the past, and the other group is more focused on the future, so to speak.
I would disagree. I would say that, like, it's rather the question about understanding of Judaism in general, like, and in a paradoxical manner, like the Haredim, as they look like they're very into the past, but nevertheless they're thinking about the future when they cry, and because let's ask ourselves, what do we miss without the temple? What do we miss without the temple in modern Israel? If we set aside the question about the temple, modern Israel looks very much as the prophetic visions of the prophets of the past. Right? The Jewish nation prospers on its land, and people can.
So if that's the case, I mean, if that's the case, how come we still weeping and crying?
So that's what I'm thinking, because we miss maybe some part of Judaism. I mean, we don't see it, we don't understand it. We are in denial to that part of Judaism, literally, like when we see what's the mission of the temple, to be the temple for the whole entire world, to bring the whole entire world into one place to pray to one God. And that's what, like, if you're talking about, let's say, religious Zionism or national circles, they tend to be even more isolated than the Haredi society. From that point of view, we are here. We need to prosper, and we need to establish the Jewish life in Jewish land, and that's it. And this is the vision. This is the, and that's why they.
So let me just get this clear, Tamir. If I understand you correctly, what you're saying, it's pretty radical. This idea is pretty radical. You say
Yes.
that we weeping and crying, not necessarily the destruction of a temple per se, not necessarily this. We're weeping and crying over a certain part of our lost identity. We lost
Yes.
something with
Exactly.
the loss of a temple. We lost something as the Jewish people, and that's actually an interesting correction.
As a spiritual movement, like universal spiritual movement for the whole entire world. We, like, it is written that the Judea.
In other words, we basically became a shtetl Judaism. We basically became a
Yes.
Judaism for the Jewish people,
Yes.
just that. And we totally forgot the ideal of us being, so to speak, the light into the nations, that type of thing, right?
Yes, yes. I mean, we declare it. We very much, especially in national circles, it's very common to declare that we are light unto nations, and we have to be like this. But on the practical level, we very much
We're pretty much still stuck in the ghetto, more or less.
stuck in the ghetto. We're stuck in ourselves, in the ghetto
Greg, what do you think about
ourselves.
it? Does that radical proposal of Rabbi Zaltzman, does that make sense to you? What do you think?
I don't know. On some level, it might, because if you know, I talk to a lot of people, like in the I guess the settlement communities and also the Rav Kook community, and if you look at, let's say, the world today, you know, I really like. Let's say you go to America, you go to any Orthodox community in America, I would go out on a limb and I would say that a person from an Israeli settlement would not be able to, like, he wouldn't be able to live in an American community, not even an American from community, because it's so different for him. I mean, I can only speak for myself. Like, I became, you know, Torah observant primarily in Israel. Actually, I was going to correct you. I made Aliyah originally in 2010. And you know, 2011, 2012, 2013, that's kind of when my process happened. And when I moved back to America, I found myself like a, you know, a fish out of water. Because again, there's certain, you know, here in Israel, there's just, like, there's certain things that don't apply when you're outside of Israel. So if you want, so if Rabbi Tamir is saying ghetto, yeah, it's true. It's just it's a ghettoification as a result of the progressions that have happened in Israel, to the point where a person who's already kind of in that, I apologize, guys, I have Arab neighbors and they like having Pigan Key. So a person who's already in that space, and then he leaves that space and he goes to, like, Hutzlar, to go to America, anywhere around the world, it's just like, what's going on, you know? But if you look at the world today, it's so like antithetical to everything the Torah is, you know, prescribing or talking about. And then you look at, like, what, and that's the question, like, why do, for example, from communities in America close themselves and get, like, so to speak, ghettos? Because they cannot expose themselves to, like, I don't know, Manhattan or secular life. Like, they always, I remember when I moved back to America, they told me, you need
So you're saying, if I'm just trying to summarize what you've been saying, you're basically saying that we kind of need to be building those walls just to protect ourselves, so to speak.
I don't know.
Is that true in Israel as well, or just in America?
I don't know if we need to be. I think it's just a byproduct of what's going on either in the world at large, or if you're in Israel, it could be a byproduct of what's going on in Israel. Because you have these different communities, and you have, like, you know, what the media is doing, hitting, you know, religious or secular, and you have all this. You know, there's a lot of stuff going on in Israel that's not exactly Torah. You know what I'm saying? Like Torah prescribed. to put it lightly. You know, you go to a place like Tel Aviv, other places.
There's a lot of
so
strife. There's a lot of conflict in Israel.
Not just only strife, but like, you know, if you're not careful, a person who's a Torah observant Jew can get caught in some places you don't want to be. Both in Israel and also in America. So again, it's like we're forced to build these things. Even if we want to be a light unto the nations, you know? Like I look at somebody like Chabad, these guys go into those places, you know, they send shluchim out, and they send these emissaries, and they go and live in places where it's the lowest of the low, the darkest of the dark, and they pull Jews from like these places. Like I personally don't know how they do it. It's really a skill, you know, that they have in their, you know, the Hasidut and their how to do these things. But other than that, it's not easy. You know,
I hear. So we actually have a bit of a disagreement here. That's interesting. Which brings me to the next question, which I think, remember, we decided, it was kind of my idea I found some article about Jerusalem being under siege. And I was thinking, are we under siege today? And we seem to have a little bit of a different perspectives here between the two of you. And I would like to ask you this question directly. What do you think? We as Judaism, we as Jews living in diaspora, we as Jews living in Israel, are we under siege today? Rabbi Zaltzman, what do you think?
Especially today, we're under the siege. When the Twitter says that Trump's tweets should be banned because they hate speeches, and Khamenei's speeches to eliminate Israel, they're completely okay, then I think that the question whether we are under the siege, they're like pretty rhetorical questions. However, we think, so maybe we need to redefine the mission of Israel, of this new identity of Jewish thought, which is the state of Israel. And it's a pretty new identity because for 2,000 years we developed the identity of the Jewish nation in the exile, trying to survive and trying to keep some kind of spark of holiness in any place where we are. But this is not as much under the siege because the Jewish community exists even in Iran, in Tehran, and they I don't think that they feel like under the siege. They have to comply with the regime, but nevertheless, their physical existence is not under the threat. However, the identity of Israeli identity definitely stands to the test of survival each and every day and each and every minute. So we need to define for ourselves as a nation, what does it mean for us? And when people ask me what will be the next step, I say, you know what will be the next step? We'll go to China and to India, to Japan, to all the countries that are not under the umbrella of Abrahamic religion. Whether we willingly will do it or unwillingly, but yes, if we are talking about light unto nations, then we cannot put up with the situation where part of the world is exposed to the Abrahamic heritage and part of the world is not exposed to Abrahamic heritage.
So you're charting a course for the future, but at the same time, you seem to agree that we're under siege. There's a bit of a conflict here, what I hear. On one hand, you're saying that we're under siege, we kind of need to defend ourselves, but then you say, no, we need to go out and we need to spread Abrahamic values, and we need to remember the Judaism of the old days with the temple, which was the Judaism that wasn't just the Judaism of the ghetto. That was the Judaism that was proactive. It was the Judaism of Kimitzayont, etc. From Zion, the Torah shall spread. So how we bridge that gap? That seems to be quite a gap here.
Greg, do you have something to say? No?
Greg is muted right now, I think.
Unmute yourself.
Greg is muted.
Unmute yourself.
Greg needs to unmute himself. Greg, you hear us?
There we go. Okay.
Greg? Oh, yeah.
Okay.
Okay, you got it.
No, it's funny you were mentioning the whole, you know, I guess the Far East not being exposed to Abrahamic religions. I mean, if you look at what's going on in South Korea, you know, and they're doing this whole thing with Talmud in their school system. I don't know how they're, you know, they're doing it for necessarily religious purposes, but they see a value in this, you know, in this literature, as it were. And I don't know, before COVID, if you walked around, you know, let's say Jerusalem, you see tourists from China, from Japan, from Korea, like every day. And it seems like, I don't know, if we're not going to them, they're going to come here.
Well, they come here.
You know, and it's almost like a thing of like, you know, we're going to have a house of prayer for all nations, and already the people already are, you know, they're kind of front running that, as we say in Wall Street. They're going, you know, before the train, as it were, and they're coming here. They're interested. They want to know. They're learning Hebrew. They're learning Talmud. They're going to Panovich Yeshiva, and they're filming, you know, specials for their television. So it's interesting.
Yeah,
it's interesting what's happening.
That's very good. But
you know what? You remember Korea? I wanted to say a few words about Korea because I've been to Korea. And I had a very interesting episode. We were there at the Interfaith Conference. So we were in a metro, in a subway of Seoul, wearing yarmulkes. Three guys from. I was representing Israel at the time, even though I lived already technically in America. So me and two other guys, Jewish religious guys, and all of a sudden, some elderly man, so happy, starts hugging, and it's almost like he's so joyous. It's like. And then he sees people with yarmulkes, and probably not a common sight, of course, in Seoul. You don't have Jews there to begin with, almost no Jews, even though there is a Chabad house there who supplied us with kosher food. And there's a very small community. But he's so excited. He points at us, Israel, Israel. I would say yes. And he kisses and hugs, so excited. I never seen so much excitement about Israel. Apparently, as you're absolutely right, Greg, there's the sentiment in South Korea specifically. And you know what, you're probably aware of this march that happens on Sukkot. Sukkot, of course, is the time we celebrate the idea of what we can call, I guess, Jewish universalism, what Rabbi Zaltzman was talking about. And now they're having this march, organized by Christians, by the way, from many countries from around the world come to Jerusalem to show their support. So that is changing, but going back to Tisha B'Av, we already at Sukkot right now. We're still holding by Tisha B'Av. We're still holding by.
Yes. So I wanted to expand a little bit about Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai. You know, he's perceived by many as an anti-hero of Tisha B'Av, his story, right? Because he escaped Yerushalayim under the siege, and he came to Espasianus, and he, as like some people would say on the very low slang, he sold Yerushalayim, he sold Jerusalem, he sold temple to Romans.
You know what he could have asked? He had 3 wishes to be fulfilled. He could have asked for Jerusalem, and he didn't.
And he didn't. Instead, he asked for Yavne and its sages, and just let us to come to. It struck me this year. I just imagine this image. Yerushalayim is destroyed, and the temple is burned, and everything holy is taken to, like the menorah and the special trumpets, and everything is taken to Rome. While in Yavne, the life seems going like usual. The people are going to yeshiva, learning Torah, and it doesn't bother them that much, the destruction of the temple. So we see here, like the birth of if you wish, I wouldn't say Haredi worldview, the birth of survivalistic tactics or strategy of Jewish people, like to be ready to give up on the universal mission and to concentrate instead on the personal survival, even if it's spiritual survival.
That's very interesting you're saying that, because, you know, actually, ironically, from secular sources, from Zionist sources, there's a very famous person, Asher Ginsburg, who is more well known by his pen name, that's Achad Ha'am. and he's considered to be the father of cultural Zionism. Now, he takes the story as one of the most important stories in what he considers to be the birth of Anshe Ruach, the people of the spirit. And it says, Yochanan ben Zakkai is an example of a person who could, like a good chess player, he could foresee where the game is going. He understood that the temple is already destroyed. And so he took it to a next step. He understood, and that's what he says. That's what he says. His criticism of his modern day political Zionism was that political Zionists are only focused on today. We need to be focused on the future. We need to bring up leaders that will be able to see the big vision of the people, that will be able to read the map correctly and see what are the next steps to take. And the example he's giving is actually Yochanan ben Zakkai. So there's I very much recognize what you're saying. I think you're saying a very interesting thing, and again, quite radical. But on the other hand, it's interesting to see that from a secular, so to speak, perspective, but more spiritual perspective, secular spiritual, if you allow, which probably what Asher Ginsburg Achad was saying, this could be actually an example of what type of leaders we need. Greg, what do you have to say about it?
I was actually going to segue, if you guys will allow me. I was thinking about, Tamir was mentioning the whole survivalism thing. I mean, I look at the way, I started thinking about this because you guys, I don't know if you guys heard something that happened with this comedian, what's his name, Seth Rogen, when he said about, that he was lied to by his parents and grandparents about Israel, and he went on a podcast. He said that we weren't told that there were people there before we came back. Basically, this kind of limited.
Oh, right. They all talk about it today. Yeah.
Yeah,
and
it got me thinking, like,
Facebook everywhere.
It got me thinking, like, you're asking the question, like, are we under siege? We're under siege because we're under siege, like, psychologically, because we're just like, we had the Holocaust, and then a bunch of Jews came from Europe to the States, let's say, and they wanted to rebuild life in America. I'm not even talking about the Orthodox community, just, secular Jews, Poland, Russia, whatever it is. And now you have their descendants, these grandkids, great-grandkids, who are basically just like, the whole thing is just to survive, and their only connection to Judaism is basically like, well, let's just make sure nobody kills us. In their mind, it's like the alt-right guy, or the, white supremacist. Some people acknowledge there's people on the left that are trying to kill them. Whatever it is, their identity is just, let's not get killed. Let's be in America, let's not get killed. Or he's from Canada. There's no, forget about Israel, forget about all this other stuff, forget about the progression of, like, I don't know, Jewish history, Jewish future. Let's just be in our diaspora thing and physically survive. They're not even talking about Torah at this point. They're just talking about, like, physical survival and keeping, you're talking about, like, cultural. They're not even talking about cultural Zionism. They're just talking about, like, whatever they think Jewish culture is, which I don't.
If I get you right, Greg, this is the real Tisha B'Av, you say, today.
Yeah, that's Tisha B'Av. The fact that they're just, it's 80% of our nation, at least if you look at America, is just, I would use the word lost. It's lost.
So if that's the case, I would like to ask you another question then. Rabbi Zaltzman, Greg, we touching upon what you basically saying, Greg, right now, is 80% of these Jewish people are lost. I don't think they're totally lost. The question though is, what do we do? What do we do? And in reference to Tisha B'Av specifically, I personally can tell you from my experience that I think it's very difficult for me personally to read the same text of the Kinot that goes for hours and is focused primarily on the tragedies of not only the destruction of the temple, tragedies that happened in the medieval times. What do we do today to connect? It's even difficult for me. So what are we talking about? People who don't know a word of Hebrew. What do we do to reconnect? What do we do to reconnect our brothers and sisters in Israel as well, by the way? Because in Israel, it's a big issue, right? Connecting to the Torah in a meaningful way. How do we do that in diaspora? How we do that in America? How we make it relevant? How we make let's look at Tisha B'Av right now. How we make Tisha B'Av relevant? Let's start with that.
I don't know, because in my opinion, this is the most problematic day in Jewish calendar in terms of like presenting Judaism with it, because all other holidays and memorial days, they have some kind of you know, of a hope, of a celebration, like Pesach. It's a liberation from slavery, and Shavuos is like giving of the Torah, wisdom, etc., spiritual teaching. Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, Sukkot, all these Shabbos, all the beautiful ideas. While Tisha B'Av is like always like striking on your chest and admitting your own shortcomings, your failures. And it's like, how can you, although Tisha B'Av is like observed almost as like Yom Kippur, if you think about it, it's the same.
I recently saw statistics. You know what? 22% of Israelis observe the fast, and about 40 or 45% of Israelis. It's a recent poll, 2019. About 40 to 45% of Israelis actually said that they observe Tisha B'Av as a national mourning day. That's a very significant percentage. That means almost half the country does.
It's much easier to observe it as a mourning day without fasting, you know. But in Jewish tradition, like as I said, we try to connect it to Yom Kippur. We try to find some kind of you know, atonement, if you wish, in Tisha B'Av. But again, it's very hard, like, to come to people with the idea of fasting. Rather, if you talk about mourning, if you talk about the destruction, about the tragedies, unfortunately, our nation is very masochistic, and we like tragedies, and we like to talk about what they did to us. And this is,
which is the most of the kinot, the most of the eulogies we read. Is really focused on that, which is quite depressing, you know.
So my idea, one of my ideas was how to reconnect, is to have actually the workshops that like to allow people to compose their own, you know, kinos, and to read them instead of official texts, which I think actually were created, as we know, the kinos were created not in one day. It's not that the temple was destroyed and then from the heavens the book of Kinot came and said, there you read it on Tisha B'Av. So it became like through the centuries.
It's a cumulative process. It's quite interesting. You really see the discussions of how to commemorate in the Talmudic period.
Basically, I think that we should to keep this tradition of not necessarily accumulating, but like slow, like the renewed creativity, even in the morning. So, and we know that
for you, primarily, this day is still the day of mourning, right? Mainly, like if the way you look at it, even in a more contemporary context, you would still define it as a day of mourning, right?
I don't know. It's
because again, you see, that's the question we had at the beginning, right? It was a question between the people in black weeping by the wall, the people in white singing and dancing, and who's right? And both of you said both of them are right.
Yes. This is like, you're right. Yes.
Can I pose a very controversial idea? You mentioned like all the kinot and all, you know, the things that we read about in the past, you know, whatever it is, Crusades. If you look at the 2013 Pew Research poll of the American Jews, and they were asked, what is the number one thing that they use to connect to their Judaism, to their culture? The number one answer was the Holocaust.
Right.
This is like secular in America. What does that mean? It means that people, you know, I always say, like, it's one thing to remember the Holocaust and never forget and all these kind of things. But when you make this one event your identity, then it almost seems like the people who do that, which is majority of American Jews, cannot see anything that happened before that. They can't even go back to the Crusades. They can't even go back to anything like the seminal moment in their lives was the
And if you
Holocaust.
remember, the first speech of Barack Obama that he gave was also very much probably the speechwriters were some of the Jews of that type of thinking, because basically he mentioned the right of existence of Israel based on the Holocaust, if you remember.
Yeah, it's nuts. It's actually nuts. And like, I think if you detach the identity of the modern Jew from the Holocaust, again, not to forget about it, but detach his identity from that, a whole new world opens up to him, and now he's able to go back even further. And it's not even so much I mean, it is a mourning thing, but he's actually able to look back in history and be like, wow, okay, we had a temple. There's something to this thing, to this structure. There's, okay, let me explore that. Let me, you know, become interested in what this is all about, and maybe explore my heritage even further. You know, maybe there's like, I don't know, just like there's like Haredi people in Flatbush who can trace their lineage all the way back to like, you know, the rabbis from the Talmud. Maybe some of these people can start digging and become interested, and it becomes a whole new world for them, you know, as opposed to just like staying on the Holocaust, you know, and that's your identity. And to the point where, again, it just goes back to like, oh, we have to stop the next Holocaust, you know, back to this Iran thing. It's like, yeah.
So you're kind of resonating with what Tamir was talking about. It's kind of what you're saying. It's more of a survivalist type of a mode, right? Where we basically, and even more so, I would even add to that. I think you add in another point here. If I read you right, if I understand what you're saying correctly, I think what you're saying is, as also part of a very unhealthy, any psychologist would tell you, if you have this victim mentality, if you have this thinking of being a victim, it's an extremely unhealthy type of a situation. So now we seem to have that for almost on a national scale. I would actually take it, I would take it a little bit more controversial way, what you're saying about the secular Jews. I would take it as a question regarding the way we commemorate Tisha B'Av. We think about it. Most of the eulogists, right? Most of we're saying, it's weeping and crying, and it's all about us being victims in a way, right? Is not a problem. Is not a problem.
What, the victimization of our consciousness?
I'm just touching upon what Greg spoke about the Holocaust and building your whole identity on the Holocaust, and how dangerous this is, and how this idea of victimization is dangerous. Potentially, we can see quite a bit of it in the eulogies, in the kinot as well. No? Am I wrong?
We see it, but less as a victimization and more just like, you know, for example, like the last 9 days, I'm here in Jerusalem, and I really feel like there's something missing. It's not a victimization. It's more just like something is missing. And you know, you read the kinot and you read about what are the kind of recurring things that happen that constantly remind our nation that, yeah, something is missing. Meaning if all these crusades and all this stuff didn't happen, if we just had the temple destruction and we went all the way from temple destruction to just like, you know, everything is hunky-dory for 2,000 years, and then we got like, we didn't have a Holocaust, let's say, and we just got like, I don't know, we just came back to our land. We just decided one day after 2,000 years to come back to our land, and we just had, just a long period in between of just nothing, just us being in the diaspora for whatever reason. I don't know, money, business. But it's almost like these things happen just to remind us to be connected to something, not a victimization, but more of just like a slap in the head. Hey, wake up! Every so often, every 100 years, 200 years. Hello, Prasnis, you know, like wake up.
So you're saying the context matters a lot. If you take a Holocaust as a single event and with all the significance of it, but you build your identity solely on that, that inevitably will cause some sort of victimization and very limited understanding of who you are as a Jew. But here you're saying in kinot it's different. And I agree with you, by the way, because I just remembered now, this year was when I was reading kinot, I usually tend to focus on the part that is very sad, right? The tragedy part, the Crusades and all the negative things that we read about, and all this, how Jews were butchered and killed and destroyed. This year, I focused on the very end of kinot, where he speaks about how much we have yawning for building Zion, for building Jerusalem, for building Israel, how much yawning there is. So that part, this year, somehow, I really kind of accentuated that part. So I agree with you 100%. Rabbi Zalman.
You know, I was just thinking while I was listening to you guys speaking and discussing this, I was thinking about the Helsinki syndrome. right? When the victims develop,
Stockholm syndrome.
Stockholm syndrome, no? I think Stockholm, yeah.
Okay, well,
Yeah.
It's close.
it's Scandinavian
Next,
syndrome.
Scandinavian over here.
Stockholm syndrome, and the victims develop some kind of dependency on their perpetrators. And then I just realized maybe we use Tisha B'Av as a tool, as a means to strengthen this victim syndrome in us that will allow us in the galus, in the exile, to develop like normal relations with the people around us. I mean, to justify our situation in the exile, we had to portray ourselves as victims, and then through the Stockholm syndrome, actually to submit ourselves to the nations that we lived in. And from that point of view, the Holocaust was kind of antithesis to this Stockholm syndrome. Like when we suddenly face something that so much bigger and stronger, it does not allow us to normalize our relations to the people and nations around us, that it finally moved us to create the state of Israel. And maybe for that purpose, the Tisha B'Av doesn't serve its goal as like to victimizing us and creating more positive approach to the people around. I mean, the dependency, like, you know, like in Stockholm syndrome.
So you're saying basically there's almost like some sort of a coping mechanism that potentially could be somewhat dysfunctional. The way you describe it.
Yes.
The way you describe it's a coping mechanism that is dysfunctional.
Yes. Well, it served its purpose while we were in exile, and
right.
Without the state of Israel, then it definitely serves its purpose. We victimize ourselves, and we feel fear from the nations around us, and we comply and we submit ourselves to them, and by doing that we survive. But you know, after the Holocaust, we need some other coping mechanisms and some other ways of self-manifestation as the Jewish nation and nation of God.
So that's very, very interesting what he's saying. So if I may, then my next question to both of you would be, based on what you just said, that we must kind of restructure the way we look at Tisha B'Av in that context as well. And my question to you would be, if you would be able to do it, how would you do it? What would be your emphasis? And how would you teach about Tisha B'Av? And how would you commemorate this day? What would you do? Maybe Greg this time first?
I was talking to the winemaker of Shiloh Winery, and I was helping him. You know, I was creating a graphic for him for one of his social media things. And he told me, I want you to do a graphic for me connected to the story of the Rabbi Akiva and the fox. For those watching don't know, it's a famous story. You know, Rabbi Akiva, there's a bunch of rabbis that go up to Yerushalayim, and they're rending their clothes, and they're crying, and he, what is it? He sees a fox.
They see the fox.
They also the
Holy of Holies. Right.
Yeah, and he's laughing, and they're like, "Why are you laughing?" And he's like,
No, he asked them, "Why are you crying?"
Why? He asked them, "Why are you crying?" They're like, "Well, what is it? The fox is running around in a place where, you know, a person who used to go to the Kodashim would die." And he basically said, "Well, hello. There was like the first temple in this who was the prophet Uriah, and then there was a second temple, and so I know from those two temples, I know there's going to be a third, and that's why there was
a prophecy about a destruction, but it was also prophecy about the temple being rebuilt. So he wants to connect the two and wants to say as much as the first one now has been fulfilled, now I realize that
Right.
it's telling me that the second one will be fulfilled. So it basically learns from destruction, it learns about the reality of the future building of the temple.
So the winemaker told me, you know, he goes, and he says to me, I know that I'm also part of prophecy because, you know, a few prophets spoke about the rebuilding of, you know, the cities and the vineyards coming alive again after 2,000 years. So he's part of that. So he goes, I know, just like Rabbi Akiva knew, I know that I'm part of that prophecy, and which gives me solace and hope for the future, that I know that, you know, the temple's going to be rebuilt. Just like I know these prophecies happen, and I'm part of it, and I'm actively a participant in it, and I see what's going on in Israel, and the people are coming back, you know, and people are making aliyah and kibbutz galiot. I know that we're going to have a third temple. So it's almost like it's a from that story, and connected to what we're actively involved in. It's like a hope for the future. So it's a whole new way to look at Tisha B'Av, as opposed to just.
In other words,
You know,
to summarize what you
destruction.
just said, this is a very beautiful thought. You're basically saying, much like Rabbi Akiva, we need to adopt that vision of Rabbi Akiva. We need to see right in the middle of this bitter lemon, we need to see the lemonade that's already coming out of it, so to speak, right? More or less, what you've been saying.
Yeah.
That's very nice.
I was
awesome.
thinking about like we were talking about the victim awareness, victim consciousness. So maybe Tisha B'Av should be made into the day of like teaching how not to become the victims, how not to be the victims, how not to become the victims. What you know, what's the features of the what the syndromes, what the symptoms of the victim, and how to avoid them, and how to be more creative in our in our life, not only to you know, to adopt this victim consciousness and start to survive, like
Going beyond the survival, so to speak.
going beyond the survival, going beyond the feeling of being victims of the history, you know, scapegoats of the history. We definitely need to develop some new awareness about it, like, and
That's very, very interesting. I would like to switch this conversation a little bit, if you allow, and something that I think we need to touch upon. Something that in every outreach organization they talk about a lot, but outside of the circles of outreach, you don't seem to hear too much about it, actually. But I do think it's a good topic to talk about. And that, of course, is what they call sinat chinam, right? A baseless hatred. We have been told by the sages of the Talmud, apparently it took them a long time to figure this out, because we don't find it in Mishnah. We know the temple was destroyed 70 CE. We find nothing in the Mishnah about the destruction of a temple, which is, Mishnah was already 220 CE. That's 150 years later, nothing in the Mishnah. And yet in the Talmud, which must have been more like 300 years after the destruction of the temple, the rabbis finally come up with understanding of how the temple was destroyed, why it was destroyed in spiritual sense. And they say the second temple was destroyed because of sinat chinam, because of baseless hatred. So my question to you is, we have in a very difficult year, 2020. Right now we're having this COVID all around the world pandemic. Jewish community has been hit very hard in America, in Israel, everywhere, in Russia, everywhere. This year, rabbinate, and I also received a similar psak from Moscow, by the way, came with an almost unprecedented psak that anybody who's been diagnosed with COVID and has no symptoms right now should not fast for his safety. And a similar psak came from Moscow, from Rabbi Goldschmidt. I've seen the psak. It's quite interesting. In other words, their rabbis come quite courageously to defend what is one of the very important Jewish values, the sacredness of human life. And they say people shouldn't risk their lives. Everybody who's experiencing mild or whatever symptoms of COVID shouldn't. So COVID affected us in many ways. Now we had those terrible riots in America. We have all these demonstrations. By the way, in Israel as well. We're having demonstrations right now in Israel, in America, right in the midst of this COVID. We live in some sort of who could imagine the world of 2020? Someone would have told you last year, this is what's going to happen. You would have said it's impossible. And yet it's around us. And is this somehow related to what our sages told us about sinat chinam, baseless hatred? Do you see baseless hatred around you? Do you think it's an issue today? Do you think there's a way, right in the midst of this pandemic, is there a way for us to heal it somehow?
I have a crazy idea.
Yeah.
A crazy thought. Actually, might not be so crazy. I'm a student of someone named by the name of Rabbi Mendel Kessin, and he's out in Lakewood, and he talks a lot about, you know, he relates current events in Torah, and he spoke about COVID. Speaking of Rabbi Akiva, you know, in the context of the story of Lag BaOmer, and you know, if you read the Gemara, I don't remember where exactly the Gemara talks about it. You know, the thing that actually caused Rabbi Akiva's students to die. I mean, they were speaking lashon hara on each other, but what was the physical thing that got them to perish? It was a thing called askara. It was an asphyxiation disease. They could not breathe. And Rabbi Kessin explains, he's like, the whole key to the whole equation, to this whole thing, is lashon hara. If you look at the news, if you look at what's happening, again, love him or hate him with Donald Trump and just Democrats, Republicans, you know, even internally Jews, you know, secular, religious, left-wing Jew, right-wing Jew, everything is lashon hara. The whole thing is just spin and manipulation, and just everybody's just, you know, we live in this world of, like, you know, I call it hashtags and buzzwords, you know, and we have information on our fingertips, but we don't know, we don't have the emes, we don't have the truth, we don't have clarity. And I think Hashem is just basically like, he sent us this disease just to show us, like, we have masks on, you know, and we put on, you know, it's funny, we put masks on. When did we start putting them on? Right after Purim, where we had masks on, and then we took them off, and then we put them back on again. You know, it's like we have to wake up at some point. We have to realize, like, this whole thing, this whole lashon hara stuff cannot go on, which obviously the whole thing leads to sinat hinam. You don't just have sinat hinam, you know, as we say in the Hustom Mieste. You don't have it like just come out of nowhere. Hey, I hate you, I hate you. Like, it comes from somewhere. Somebody said something, somebody heard something, you know, and, you know, off we go to the races. And I don't know. To me, it's not a shock that it's an asphyxiation issue. It's people cannot breathe, they cannot talk, and it's connected. It's connected to something that happened.
Very
Again,
interesting perspective. And you
know?
just reminded me of something, you know, I was reading today, as of course we read of Torah, you know, from Yirmiyahu. And you see the topic of lashon hara, the topic of people being misusing that gift of speech they've been given and manipulating that and not being honest to each other. And you know, all this fake news culture, we think it's a new thing. Apparently it's just being highlighted these days. It became very prominent these days, but apparently we saw it back in the day of the prophet Jeremiah, the time of the destruction of the temple. So I very much appreciate your comment. Rabbi Zalzman.
It's very hard topic, Sinat Chinam, because as much as people are talking about Sinat Chinam, and still it seems like people really are not even coming close to tackle this topic, this issue. Because even when people are talking about Sinat Chinam and how bad it is, nevertheless, very often what underlies their activities in regular life is being within their own social group, like not trying to reach out to other groups of Jews or other nations, and like even the people who do go outside and reach to other nations, let's say, and other groups of Jews, they hate other Jews, they don't do it. So it's like we are very much trapped in our inability to understand the dynamics of our own psychology when it comes to hatred and to treating the different as with the dignity. And even when we read the famous midrash that what's the difference between the mint, which makes mints the coins, and God, like each and every coin comes out of mint absolutely the same, while human beings being also minted with the same like DNA of Adam Arishon, of the first human being. Still, everyone is different, different faces, and the Midrash says even different opinions. So what was very clear to the sages back in days that everybody's might have different opinion, and we should honor it, honor the different opinion. And when you know this all this culture of banning in Facebook, let's say, when you make some
Oh, we didn't talk about cancel
comments,
culture today. That's right. That's a good one.
and
Cancel culture. Yeah.
and immediately you're banned, and you're like bans, like you're like you definitely feel hatred within all this culture, and it's okay. People are okay with it. So maybe if you wish, this culture causes all this. I don't know. This culture doesn't do a lot of good to our civilization. That's what I want to say. Yes.
You know what? I very much appreciate your comments. I think you touched upon something very, very important. And our time is almost over, because I would like to leave some time for questions and remarks of our people who are here with us. I'd like to just make a little conclusion to our conversation. If there is any conclusion, I think we had a very nice conversation here, more to come, please God, on a special day of the calendar. This seems to be a low point. But as Greg said, quoting Rabbi Akiva, this low point potentially could be for us, as it's always in Jewish history, you know, we always grow from those low points. We always know how to utilize this time of tragedy to reflect upon what happened, to learn a lesson. And like Rabbi Tamir said now, learning a lesson of baseless hatred today, and looking at minor things, at small things. Why would I ban somebody on Facebook who doesn't agree with me? Why would I disconnect from someone who maybe doesn't have any personal hatred, but it just provides certain opinions that I don't want to hear? And I personally think that's a good way to start. We can start with small things. We can start by enlarging our circle of friends and allowing this sort of speaks dissent, and allowing a difference of opinions, and valuing each and every person, each and every Jew, first of all, but also each and every person as a human being, as carrying the image of God. That I think is beautiful and very, very important. And going back to the original sin of we're talking about the sin of the spies. I call the original sin, meaning in the context of Tisha B'Av, what our sages are saying, right? It seems at first glance, right? I know the irony. Please forgive me. Right, it sounded funny, I know. Yeah. So going back to the sins of the spies, it seems it's sort of disconnected from what the sages of the Talmud are saying. It has to be connected somehow.
Oh,
Connected again.
This is a keyword, a buzzword, connection, yes. And you bounce disconnect. So I guess we can then get some questions if there are some.
Yeah, if we could see. You guys have any questions? Let's see the chat. Oops.
If you, I'm turning to our listeners. If you have questions, please post them in the chat. And I appreciate your comment, William, in the chat. Well said, Rabbi Tamir. Thank you.
Somebody wrote a thing, something about the tzdukim.
Kept the
service. It could be the difference between expecting between the temple to descend from the heavens and building a temple by the people on the ground, literally. And tzdukim kept the services going and kept fighting. Interesting. Do you want to address that?
It's very hard for me. Like, besides tzdukim, there was a lot of different groups. You know, that was very funny movie. I mean, not movie. There is a series on Israeli TV. The Jews are coming. Yehudim Baim.
Yeah, Yehudim Baim.
Yehudim Baim. And they have this episode about the destruction of the temple, and it's like the Romans are coming and like one group of Jews like popping up, another third, fourth, fifth, sixth, like about like 10, like 9, 10 different groups of Jews are fighting between themselves, more between themselves than with the Romans. So to tell that
Yeah.
only Tzdukim, yeah, the Tzdukim were in the temple and they were like, they were in charge, they were more powerful in the temple. And maybe for that purpose, you know, the recognition of Tisha B'Av, it took so many years, almost centuries, by the Prussian, by the rabbinical Judaism. Maybe because maybe they had this feeling that the Tzdukim maybe were at fault that everything happened the way it happened. But
Did you see Monty Python? You know, people's front of Judea, people's front.
no.
It's also a similar thing where it's a British comedy thing where they're like revolting against the Romans, and then like there's a people's front of Judea, and they meet these guys in the tunnel, these other Sicarii, I guess, and then they're like, we should unite against the common enemy, and you think they're gonna say Romans? No, the people's
No.
front of Judea.
Yeah,
it's just like British humor.
Yeah, unfortunately, they understand us. I mean, I think that the Tzdukim with the time, they turned to be Christians, I believe, with the time.
Something similar, yeah.
Because if you go, if you imagine yourself going to the church, and when you actually look at the services that they keep there, they're very similar to what we can imagine was going on in the temple.
Mm-hmm.
You know, they like dress in special dresses like the Kohanim, and they have like the separation of the church sometime for the like, you know, like in the temple, holy and holiest of holy, and they have like it seems that they took very much from the point of view of temple service, and they incorporated it in the church services. So that's what causes me, not only this fact, but this also causes me to think that with the time the Tzdukim like accepted Christianity. Okay, we have another question.
There's a question.
Is there any independent source for any of that outside of Perusian literature? Do you understand? Is there any independent
outside
source
of the
for
Gemara, maybe?
For any of,
I mean, weren't the Dead Sea Scrolls found?
So basically, the only thing that could be outside of Perusian literature is actually the Christian literature. But even Christian literature was very much censored, as we know that in the beginning, when they wanted to create the canon of the new, so-called New Testament, they took many versions of Evangelion, and they left only 4 versions. They had much more, and we know that in the last, like in recent times, there are many like apocryphic versions of Evangelion was also uncovered in archaeological diggings, but I think that we still don't know much about the Jewish history of that time, because this is a very valid question. Probably much of the outside of Persian literature was destroyed, probably with the temple. If Tzdukim were in power in the temple, so most probably there also was their big library of their writings, and it was probably destroyed and burned during the Tisha B'Av, then destruction of the temple. So we lack a lot of historical evidence we can only, stipulate.
Mm-hmm. Any other questions, guys? I think we're
If
good.
no,
If there's no other questions, I think we can wrap up.
yep, I think we can wrap up. I would like to thank both Rabbi Haskin and you, Greg, and all
Thank
our
you.
listeners for expressing interest in this event. And thank you, Greg, for your contribution and your thoughts. And
Thank you
it
as
was
well.
very good. And maybe make such an event next time in the rebuilt temple.
Shabbat Hashem. Amen. Amen.
All right.
Hopefully it'll be the last sad Tisha B'Av.
Amen. Amen. So for
Next one, we'll be
all
happy.
those who are still fasting, continue fasting till the end. And you, Greg, good night. Laila Tov.
Laila Tov. Toda
All
Rabba.
right. All the best.
All right. All right, guys.
All right. Bye.
Let's